also, like many of you, a condominium board member. I'm the treasurer at my condominium, so looking forward to learning something from this distinguished panel here as well today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Will Delgado, I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of Castleberg. We're a residential property management firm. I know we have a number of our clients here today, Phil. And so we provide all full services of managing your community to include full service accounting.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you to Castleberg for hosting this and a great lunch. I really enjoyed that. My name is Chris Davies. You can probably tell because I think I'm the only guy in the room wearing a tie. I'm an attorney. I didn't get the memo about not wearing one. I feel naked if I'm not. I head up the condominium cooperative and homeowner association practice group at Denton's, Cohen and Grigsby. We're not too far from here, a little shorter drive than Matt had today, and we're over at Mikado. And we're here to try to help answer your questions.
Hi everybody, Joe Thompson with Acrisure. I'm a partner and client advisor with the firm. I don't know if you're not familiar with our agency. We used to be Gulf Shore Insurance. We were a locally operated insurance firm for many, many, many years, and we were purchased back in 2018. And recently, Acrisure has rebranded all of its partner agencies. So now we're part of Acrisure as a whole. And if you're a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, you're probably not happy with us because we took the naming rights of your stadium and it went from Heinz Field to Acrisure Stadium. So not a big positive change for people there. I think the fan base was pretty upset initially, but now I think it's coming together. They're getting used to it. So again, looking forward to the discussion. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interrelated questions, and we obviously welcome your questions as well. It's going to be a big part of making the discussion really good.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. So we're going to get started with our first topic, which is, if you all can hear me, is the Surfside reform, which Chris is going to start us on that. You don't have to pass it. He's got a mic.
Oh, I got a mic. One of us.
You guys get to share.
Okay. All right, Surfside. I do have a memo that I put together, just some bullet points, which might be helpful for you. And obviously, if you have questions after this, you can email me if you like. My email's on this material here. So going back to a very sad day in June of 2021, when we watched in horror as to the collapse of Champlain Tower South in Surfside, Florida. I get goosebumps just sort of thinking about that and remembering the videos of it. I was asked shortly after that by the leaders of the Florida legislature and the governor through the Florida Bar Condominium Committee to sit on a panel of 7 of us to discuss what we need to change in the law so that something like Surfside never happens again. And we worked very hard that summer. Met several times a week. We had good, robust discussion about it. It was not our goal to figure out what happened or why it happened, but it was our goal to present some legislative reforms for the legislature to consider. And we did that. And this has now been going on for a while. So we had what has sort of become affectionately known as SB 4D in 2022. That is sort of an out-of-date name, even though we still call it SBD 4D reforms. That obviously was a bill that became a law. Then we had another SB 154 the following year. SB 154 was designed to address some of the deficiencies in SB 4D. Some things that maybe weren't thought through as well as they could have been. Sometimes the legislature gets to rush on stuff. For those of you who may not have ever had a Florida civics course, it might be a surprise to you to know that the Florida legislature, I was just talking to the gentleman about this a few minutes ago, sits for 60 days, that's it. So you can imagine all the stuff that this state has to deal with. Its session ends on this Friday. We're getting updates, Matt and I have been getting updates as we sit here on our cell phone as to legislation we're going to talk a little bit about later. Looks like it's going to get passed. But it started, I think, on January the 8th. It just sits for 60 days. If you think about all the things that have to happen, including the adoption of the budget for the year, to get condo legislation front and center is quite a challenge. So sometimes when stuff goes through, and I've been involved with condo legislation for a long, long time as a member of the Florida Bar Condominium Committee, it isn't perfect. And then we have to come back and do technical amendments, and that was part of what happened with the difference between SB 4D and SB 154. So I think we're getting it right. Matt, you may or may not agree with that, but we're getting it better. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the changes that happened in, or that are expected to happen, because we don't know they're really going to happen, but we believe they will. So this reference in my outline, HB 1021, is the key bill right now. So I talked to Peter Dunbar. Some of you may know that name. He wrote a book called The Condominium Concept. He's a good friend of mine and the lobbyist for the Florida Bar. Talked to him yesterday. I said, Pete, tell me what's happening, what's moving, what's dead, what's not going anywhere, what's playing ping pong between the House and the Senate. And he was very confident that HB 1021 was going to get pushed over to the governor to be enacted into Florida law without any changes. Although the Senate hadn't finalized it, but I learned at, what was it, about 10:30 this morning, Matt? Yep. The Senate had approved it with no dissents. So 1021, HB 1021, if you really want to look at this stuff, if you have insomnia at 3 in the morning, you know, you can look it up. This is it, this entire book here. I don't want to lift it up because I'll ruin the microphone, it'll be a problem, but it is 143 pages long. And all these little yellow tabs here are points that I might talk about if we don't run out of time today, but there's a lot of stuff in it. It's a lot to unpack, and I just looked at this, I think yesterday, and in detail for the first time. I've read it 3 times, and every time I read it, I get a little more scared for my condo boards. After I talk today, I do have some resignations in my briefcase if you want to resign. No, I'm just kidding. So, I don't know whether we need to go too much in detail here on these changes because I've got them written out pretty well. I think you're more interested in knowing that the glitches that appeared in the statute have essentially been cleaned up a little bit. The dates pretty much remain the same. This is not, you know, we've had a lot of legislation over the years, and like some of the fire safety retrofit statutes, it seemed like every year it was kicked down the road. It's like, oh, another year, another year, another year. That isn't happening with this, is it, Matt? So they seem to be holding their fire on the end of 2024. Maybe you can push that until the end of 2025. We can talk a little bit more about that. But I think you're more interested today in getting into the analysis of this, both on the milestone section and on the, what we affectionately call the SIRS, Structural Integrity Reserve Studies, by letting Matt explain how that is working in the marketplace. And the one point I'm going to finish with here, and that is, do not have any doubt that this is happening. It is not coming, it is here. It needs to be done. You will need to follow the Structural Integrity Reserve Study program for the building components of the building. You may have other reserves that are not part of structural building components. I'm sure Matt will address that. And maybe most importantly, if you have been a condominium association that historically has waived reserves in their entirety, I have some very high-end clients who politely tell their board members, I'll look after my own money, thank you. Don't need the association to do that. I'm happy to write you a check when you tell me how much you need it for and when you need it by. And I'll have it, I'll deliver on that. But I don't need the association to have $50 million in the reserve accounts. I'll keep my share myself. That's not uncommon. Or maybe a little bit more common is to have a little bit in the piggy bank for the rainy day, but nothing like the amount that's going to be required effective January 1, 2025. And that was part of the problem with Champlain Tower South, is that the number got almost too big, got too difficult for boards to deal with, too much of an embarrassment, too awkward. These are my neighbors, and the can gets kicked down the road, new board comes in, what do they do, what have you. And it's an oversimplification. I don't mean to say anything disrespectful about that whole situation, but the reality is that they didn't have the money to go fix things. And when the buildings age out, it can cost a lot of money if maintenance has deteriorated. Here in where I practice primarily, buildings I think are extremely well maintained. Got a lot of 30 or 40-year-old buildings on Gulf Shore Boulevard, and then other than the visit from Hurricane Ian and Irma in recent years, they've actually done really well. They maintain their building, they're funded appropriately, but that's not true of everybody. So with that, Matt, I'm going to let you take us down deeper into the rabbit hole here on milestones and structural integrity. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, thanks, and good update. And I think affectionately they call SB 140 Condo 1.0.
Okay.
154 Condo 2.0 and Condo 3.0 did pass this morning, which was at House Bill 1021, so that's on its way to the governor. And then the HOA reform bill told us up next today, so we'll see. They always take it to the last couple of days until we find out what happens exactly up there.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, it was a great introduction, and I think a couple other things that were learned from the task force, Chris, that you headed up, and other task forces that were put together was that this case study of Champlain Tower South was while the collapse, of course, was an anomaly, we'll never see anything like that again, and there could be many factors contributed to it. Some of the things that, when they look back at some of the board conversations and some of the financial situations they were in, I don't know, that really wasn't that uncommon for a board to, like you said, waive the reserve, or owners to waive reserves. One of the biggest kind of red flags, I think, that jumped out to the legislature that looked at it was Champlain Tower's got a gorgeous lobby. They had just spent millions of dollars renovating the interior. There's pressure on all of us board members, like you said. We don't want to tell our neighbors that we have to raise the fees, and we certainly want to tell them that we have to raise the fees to do something that they can't even see, that nobody even knows about, something hidden behind in the garage or behind the walls. And so there was this concern that we were spending important money, the owners important money on cosmetic items and not taking care of structural components. And there's absolutely pressure. I deal with that on my own board of people wanting to replace the pool furniture, do the landscaping. That's the curb appeal, right? That's what's going to sell the unit. However, it cannot come at the neglection of the safety and structure of the building. So the legislature established a list of components. They drew the line somewhere in the middle, right? They didn't say we're going to reserve for everything. Some states have started to enact laws and look, we're just going to reserve for everything that's over a certain amount. Some states had those laws before. Florida had a unique law that said the owners could waive all of the reserves, and the legislature said, no, we don't want to waive reserves for this important list of items. So that you may be familiar with it, I'll just run through it quickly. The components now for which we cannot waive reserves and that are considered the structural components of the building, some of them I would argue are not structural, are roofs, the structure, load-bearing walls, primary structural systems and members. Initially, they had put foundations as an item that was listed there in floors. That put everyone up in arms because you don't replace the foundation of a building. So they changed it to this more general term of primary structural systems and members. Well, that's basically anything that supports a load in the building. So that still includes your floors and your foundation. are all part of the structural components that need to be reserved for, not necessarily for replacement though. They do clarify that that's going to be just for repairs if needed, and if nothing is needed, if you have your analysis and nothing's needed in the next 25 years, there's no funding requirement for that item. In addition to those structural components, they listed fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing and electrical systems, waterproofing, exterior painting, and then common area windows and doors. That was another kind of concern with 4D, that they just said windows and doors, and of course all the constituents and all of us that live in condos know that a lot of the condos, the owners are responsible for windows and doors. So that still remains. There's no need to fund unit owner components in the reserves portion, but you do have to fund common area windows and doors. So if the association does take responsibility for the sliders in the units, then absolutely that is part of the required funding. And then there's a catch-all that says, and any other item that has a cost, deferred maintenance or capital expense cost of $10,000 or more, and the failure to maintain that would have a negative effect on one of the other structures, or other items on the list, sorry, then that would also be required. And that's at the discretion of the person doing the structural integrity reserve study. So the best example of that one, I use a lot of seawalls. You know, if you've got a seawall very close to the building's foundation and that was to be compromised and not taken care of, it could compromise the foundation, then that then becomes a structural component. That same seawall, if it's 400 yards away on the other side of the golf course, even though it might be your responsibility, is probably not a structural component. That would be up to the person conducting the SIRS, the Structural Integrity Reserve Study. And I'm starting with SIRS because I think all buildings need SIRS that are 3 stories or more. When you reach 30 years of age, or if the local building department wants to do it at 25, then you have to also have a milestone inspection. Again, for condos, co-ops that have buildings 3+ stories. So the milestone inspection was intended more of a look to see if there's anything immediate that's needed. So the SIRS, I'd like to remind people, it's more of a long-term planning tool. It's a budget tool to make sure that there is money when items are needed. That's why we're doing them right away. As soon as the building's brand new, you're doing your SIRS. The milestone inspection, we wait 30 years, we take another look at it to ensure that it's safe. If a visual inspection called the phase 1 identifies no significant structural deterioration or need for repairs, then a letter goes to the building department, a summary of the report saying it's in good shape, and that gets filed with the building department. You do it again in 10 years. If the visual inspection identifies significant structural deterioration, then a phase 2 is needed, which likely includes removal of drywall, removal of stucco and things to identify the actual source of the issue, and then a recommendation for repairs, and then you have 365 days to commence that repair that's needed if a phase 2 is needed. So of course there's could be very big dollars involved with that side as well, but the SIRS piece is in place to ensure that the money is there for associations when that time comes, that there is a need for structural repairs. And look, we live in Florida with moisture, salt, and concrete are kind of a dangerous mix, and I'm sure you could talk I know you have whole classes about the issues that get caused with steel and structural problems that just happen to buildings. Even well-maintained buildings over time are going to require some of these structural repairs, and plumbing, electrical, none of these things are going to last forever. And so that was another kind of interesting look that I know one of the task forces that I sat on, CAI, looked at other cities throughout the world and said, well, we have all these rules about getting inspections, getting our certificate of occupancy when the building's built. But after it's built, at least in Florida, there was no statewide program to say we have to look at it again at any interval of time. Miami-Dade Broward had a 40-year recertification because of disaster, a tragedy that occurred there many years ago. Chicago and New York have facade ordinances because of pieces of buildings that have fallen off and hurt people of buildings. And so then, of course, the tragedy happens, and then the legislature steps in. In that case, it's the city ordinances. There's a few cities, Singapore and Dubai had some pretty strict re-inspection rules, but we just didn't have anything statewide, and we realized that's a liability out there. Why they didn't put this on all types of high-rise buildings or taller buildings, hotels, office buildings, we asked the legislature that. They said, well, those buildings aren't falling down, was their response. So I guess it's you know, and it's kind of a cheeky response, but really it's those buildings often don't face the same pressure that you boards of directors face. If a Marriott needs a restoration project, then all of a sudden the nightly rate goes to $289 instead of $269, and you end up you make the money. The owner of the Marriott writes the check. You have one source of income. That's a much more complex dynamic, as you know, in a condo, where you have to get everyone to pitch in their fair share. And some folks may or may not be prepared to pay for that. So that's a big difference in those types of buildings.
Yeah, I just wanted to sit back and wait for the 25th birthday, if you've got a problem. And also remember that at turnover, which is the point in time when the developer has sold 90% or more of the units and is getting ready to finish up and move on to a different project, and the board of directors composition changes from developer reps to unit owner reps, there's a whole laundry list of items in 718-301 of the Florida Condominium Act that has to be complied with by the developer, and including these, essentially what amounts to a de facto milestone inspection report. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's a SIRS, really.
It's essentially.
Yeah, essentially SIRS.
So they list a lot of the same sort of things in 301. So that can become an important document if you're, I don't know whether we have any ad hoc committees getting ready for turnover or have recently turned over. Make sure you get that, because it's done on the developer's dime. It's important to get it. If you never got it, you should go back and ask for it maybe. And that sets a nice baseline for you. It helps Matt in doing more accurate reserve studies, because you've got a baseline. But I just wanted to point out that two things. One, obviously, if you have a problem, you need to address it much earlier than the outside dates of 25 and 30 years, obviously. But there is these reports that are required to be given to the association at the time of turnover. Thanks, man.
No, that's a great point. And they did, that was another kind of fix in 154, that they weren't necessarily allowed. Go ahead.
Matt, make sure that the architectural designs are part of that turnover from the developer.
Yes. So
that gives you all the information about what went into your community and all the elements that went into that community, including the weighting of your decks, which can be abused without any knowledge of the board members.
Yep, absolutely. That 718-301 is a checklist. It's at least 20. I know there's a P and a Q, because that's some of the things that we look at. There's at least 20 items that need to be turned over at the time of turnover. Anybody
goes to S now.
Yeah, S. Yeah, you got it right there. Yeah, it goes on. Anybody going through or went through recent turnover? Developer? We're all established buildings. Okay, we won't belabor that any further. Let's see. I wanted to touch on one more thing, just about this new bill and the bills that passed today. The feeling was, we put the SIR, we put these requirements on boards, and then we started to hear some horror stories of bad actor boards, and they looked back and realized some of the framework that they put this requirements for SIRs and milestone inspections was putting pressure on a framework that had some loopholes in it and some issues in it, and was being abused, usually by our friends over in Southeast Florida, of course. They're the ones that cause most of the problems, in my opinion. They're being abused, and so now a lot of it, we probably have time to go through some of it, but a lot of it is not necessarily changes to the inspection requirements or the timing, like you said, of the requirements. It's more ensuring that boards are being transparent and not abusing that. Kickbacks is a big part of it, where they had some issues with kickbacks that are going to be addressed, and really criminal exposure now, liability for boards that don't do that. Chris will talk more about that. I wanted to talk about, we've done about 350, right about 400 structural integrity reserve studies so far throughout the state since the new law's been in place, and I wanted to share kind of what we're finding. So remember, I said there's now this group of elements that must be funded. The statute reads that none of that money can be used on anything other than its intended purpose. Doesn't care if the whole community voted to use it on something else, you cannot use that money once you set it aside for your roof or your waterproofing on anything other than its intended purpose. So if you have an elevator in the building, or carpet, or a swimming pool, and it's not on that list, you have to essentially have another set of reserves now, because you still have the requirement, remember, for all condos, you have to reserve in your budget for roofing, painting, paving, and any other expense over $10,000. That rule has been in place since 1984. And so that's still in place. So anything else over $10,000 still has to be reserved for. It's just that there's this other category, we can call it non-structural reserves, that can be still waived. Now, it used to be where you could do a waiver of those reserves by a majority of a quorum at a meeting. That's now changed. It's already effective that now it takes a majority of the voting interests to waive reserves for those other items. Or CSRS items right now can be waived. So the timeline for when this kicks in, Chris mentioned the due date for your milestone inspection if you're of that certain age, and the due date for the structural integrity reserve study is the same, December 31st of this year. So we're down to 9+ months. Question?
Yes, I have a question. If a building, Highrise has $1.1 million set aside for replacing the roof, and that money was obtained from a fire in the building, and it is set aside for the roof replacement in a couple of years, can the board vote to label it, even though it is going to be used for the roof, for reserves, instead of just keeping it in an independent, bank account? And can you do that also for contingencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, generally, I think the board can do that. If they have a surplus 1 year, or whatever it might be, in your case, an insurance proceed, and they want to dedicate that to reserves, I think they can do that. The problem would be taking it out. So if you wanted to use it on anything else now, then it would take the owner, a majority of the voting interest, to take it out.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm fully understanding the question, but if it's going to ultimately be used for the roof, I'd be inclined to move it over and have it in the roof account. Otherwise, your roof calculation is going to get queered, right?
Correct. Yeah. No. Otherwise, you'll be mandated by this statute. Right. If you don't have it, if you're starting at zero for your reserve, then you're mandated to treat that.
You're going to overfund.
Dancing time.
Dancing time. Oh, those iPads.
Good
they're always
reminder.
connected.
Yeah,
They're always watching.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm understanding correctly. So you have a reserve account. Within the reserve account, are you itemizing the items covered by the reserve account and setting aside a specific amount of money for that?
Good question. So, and there's two methodologies.
And there's pooled reserves and...
Yes, so you hit it. There's two methodologies of reserves. One is pooled reserves, which is a group of assets looked at as a fund overall. And the other one is called component reserves, or sometimes called restricted reserves, sometimes called straight line reserves. I call it sometimes the old-fashioned way of doing reserves, where you do it on pen, paper, and pencil without even a spreadsheet. You can calculate reserves on that methodology or the pooled methodology. You can still use the pooled methodology, but now, because there's a restriction on that one set of components, that group of assets has to be in its own pool. And then you can have another pool
non-structural
of reserves for non-structural, exactly. So they can both be pooled. I just don't think they can be pooled together. I think they can be pooled together for investment purposes only, but your accounting would have to show a separate, you might want to speak to this too, Will, about how you show the separate liabilities on your balance sheet.
I have another follow-up to the follow-up. Regards the non-structural reserves, it now sounds as if you're saying if it's costs more than $10,000, you have to set aside a non-structural reserve account. Who determines whether it's like if I've got furniture or if there's one couch?
Great question. And that's always been a bit of a debate, right? So before the collapse, before any of these laws were in place, the board could determine what was in the reserve account. And the law was roofing, painting, paving, and anything else under $10,000. Can't tell you how many associations I've worked with I've been doing it for 25 years now, had roofing, painting, paving, that's it. Nothing else costs over $10,000, right? So that's probably a big issue with a lot of boards, is that they were surprised, including Champlain Power South, about how much the concrete restoration cost, because it wasn't roofing, painting, or paving. People are surprised all the time by their elevator costs, their plumbing costs, electrical costs, and lobby renovation costs, right? So The rule, and we've debated this with the division over the years, they've kind of come out and said if you can break an item into small pieces that are less than $10,000, then you can get away with not reserving for it.
So a lobby restoration could be so much for the floor, so much for the couch.
Yes.
So much for the picture on the wall.
Right,
It'll
right.
never come up to $10,000.
Your floor is probably going to be $10,000.
Unless it's, repurposed linoleum.
Yeah, right. But so yes, I mean, you can break it down. It's a slippery slope, right? Because there was even an old division director that said, well, plumbing can be broken down in all these little fittings and all the sections of pipe, and you never have to replace it all at once. But in reality, when you go to reline the plumbing, it's going to be well over $10,000. So I think boards can still get away with that, but I wouldn't recommend trying to go too far down
the loophole.
I just want to have a sort of real dive in on the pragmatic part of this in terms of what documents go to the owners for consideration, okay? And this is maybe a Castle Group question, okay? Because I don't necessarily know the mechanics of this, and I think it would be helpful if in the room for everybody to understand how we're doing this. So, question to both you guys, are you now producing essentially Reserve Schedule A, which essentially would be the SERS, the building component items, and then which can't be waived, okay? And then a Reserve Schedule B, which would be the non-restricted, such as maybe your seawall that isn't near the building doesn't impact on the infrastructure, or maybe a standalone one-story clubhouse or something like that, which maybe, I don't know what category that falls in, that may be a bad example, but whatever the items are that are not necessarily in the list, the subparagraph G of the statute, how are we doing that? How is Castle Group doing this in terms of and you haven't had to do this yet because we're not there yet, but are you going to present two different schedules and we're going to have two different votes on all of that? How are we doing that?
Yeah.
So I don't know, I haven't really thought it through.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that question here in a second, Chris. There was something I said before when we were talking about turnover, and even we have all of our communities here said they're not new; they've turned over already. I don't want to miss one particular piece there. So when you turn over, Matt had mentioned there is a distinct list of what is supposed to come to you as a community. And prior to being with Castle Group, I was a developer, a high-rise developer, and I had gone through a turnover process many times. And I can tell you, we showed up there with a couple of carts worth of materials that are turned over, more specifically plans. And every plan that you can imagine necessary to build your building, and that's a lot of plans. If I put them on this desk, it would stack about this high. So the point I wanted to make there is for our board members here now, do you know where your plans are? Because there have been many times we've walked into a new community, and it's the first thing we'll ask when we're searching through the files, etc. And quite often we find that they're in some back closet, not protected, not well organized. And when you get down the road to this point in time where you're now doing many things in your community where an engineer, an architect, someone needs to reference how was this building built, you really don't want to have guesswork going on there. So it becomes incredibly important that those plans are well protected, someone knows exactly where they're at, and that you have the full set. And if you don't, you can go to the county and take this.
So the county has to have, does the builder have to turn a set of the files over to the county?
They do. They do. And I can tell you that, so I used to build here, folks. I used to live here in Naples. I built in the Colony Golf and Bay Club, which is not too far from here. And we used to turn over a full set, a record set, to Lee County, because on that part we were in Estero, so we turned over to Lee County. But they are required to maintain them. I will tell you this, depending on where you live, because we Castle Group, we manage properties throughout the state, and the counties are not great at maintaining those records in all places. We have very big struggles on the East Coast. We talk about Broward and Palm County, where they give us the shrug about, when we're looking for the plans. So, if you don't know where your plans are now, go take a look at your office and see if you can locate them. But I'm telling you now, they're incredibly important. And when you start things like a SERS inspection, your engineer certainly wants to take a look at those to understand what standard, and the Florida Building Code changes about every 2 years, isn't it? Changes about every 2 years. They want to understand at the time your building was built, what was going on there. Yes, sir.
But if the county doesn't have them.
Then you got to hope. And by that I mean, let's see if your architect, your various engineering firms are still in business and that they would have those records still on hand. Unless you were built a very long time ago, which is not really the case here in the Naples market, they should have the CAD file where they could reproduce it for you. Now, again, that also depends on, is my firm who was part of the design team still in business? Okay. There was a question about the reserves and how to set those up. So every year we go through the great debate, which is known as the budget process, with every one of our communities. And I will tell you, we watched the evolution of these bills from the time Surfside first happened, going from 4D to 154 to now 1021. And trying to figure them out just as much as anyone else. And we had an approach, particularly for our boards, of let's educate our folks as information becomes available. Our founder, James Donnelly, our CFO, Craig Vaughn, both of them have held a number of webinars to educate boards out there, whether you're a client or not of ours, so that you could help understand what's happening here. But specifically to this reserve piece, we like to customize it to what our board, the way they want to see it. These items that are now included under the structural piece, they're non-negotiable. So whether we list it out in a single tab,
Sure.
or if we separate it because they'd rather see it that way, which, by the way, would be my own personal preference, that I can distinctly see these items which I know are mandatory, we will accommodate how our client wants to see it. Nevertheless, though, we're going to follow the law first in that, and make sure we have those items in there. I will tell you from the property management perspective, the passage of these laws through the legislature has actually helped us. We now have the law on our side. We used to have, I said the great debate before, kind of jokingly, but there's always a debate as to what were you going to do in terms of funding the reserves. I was speaking to a number of our clients who are here in the room earlier before we got started about the chickens have come home to roost for those communities that chose to defer for many, many years. A side story, I actually was in Champlain Towers, the one that collapsed, in 2018. They were interviewing us. We were landing some new properties in that Bell Harbor market, and if you're not familiar with the geography, Surfside abuts Bell Harbor. So we were called in. I went into that building. I was just doing a cursory look, similar to a phase one inspection, Matt, right? And with my developer background, I have a better idea of what I'm looking at here, but I was speaking to the board, and I had said how I noticed a number of things. Very obvious cracking, spalling, particularly in the garage where we parked, that garage that was on the news. And I was talking to the board about what do we intend to do about this. And we've taken out properties that were in not great shape, with a discussion with the board of what is the plan here. The reason I bring that up was the attitude at that point was, we'll wait for the 40-year. So Chris had mentioned before about kicking the can down the road, and that's exactly what was happening there. So our approach has always been, fund your reserves properly. For the owners who live in the building, you are paying as you go, so to speak. You know, there are some buildings where they waived, so if I lived in the building for 10 years, I never contributed a dime towards the reserves. Year 15, now you have to replace something. Guess what? All the current owners are the ones who are paying all of that money now all at once. The attitude that Chris mentioned before as well of, I'll take care of my money. There are a number of buildings saying, no, we don't fund our reserves because when we need a big lump sum of cash, we simply special assess. It's a way of doing it. Tougher on some than others, but nevertheless, the money comes due at some point, and I'm actually glad to see that the legislature has passed these laws because it is forcing the hand of owners. It has made it tough, given our current economic environment with higher inflation, other various costs which have skyrocketed. It has made it tough on some folks. Some have been forced to sell. That's an unfortunate effect of it, but at the end of the day, the board has a fiduciary responsibility for the overall safety of the residents by maintaining the building.
A number of our reserve items were destroyed with Ian, and therefore will restart the amortization as we go forward. Will we have an opportunity to readjust with this legislation what we have in each one of the buckets in our current reserve study so that we are more adequately funded for those items that are going to come up sooner than later? That's number one. And I have another question about the inspection that took place before July 1, 2022, which I note in the notes may be used depending on your local.
Okay, yeah. Let me answer. The first one is yes, you should update it. In fact, your reserve schedule that goes out with that goes out with the budget. Side note: make sure you have a reserve schedule that goes out with your budget. It's one of the things that gets overlooked a lot. Is that we forget to put that other page on there. That should actually be updated every year because you're going to have an item in your less of life, and you're going to have certain things that need to be adjusted. Costs need to be adjusted. So it really should be updated every single year. Boards have always been able to do that themselves and make those adjustments themselves. Now, with the new law, it says for any budget adopted on or after December 31st of 2024, the reserve schedule must follow the most recent CSRS. So, if you had a CSRS, and we probably didn't because it wasn't in place, if you had a CSRS in 2020, and now we've got all these adjustments to make, you would need to update your CSRS to then reflect to match the budget, essentially. I think that's where associations will get into trouble. It does say in the statute as well that you can make, the board can make annual adjustments for inflation. So that's kind of the extent of the amount of adjustments they want the board to make in between structural integrity reserve studies. Right now, the law says the structural integrity reserve study has to be done every 10 years, which is way too long in my opinion, and others as well. That would be equivalent looking at your financial plan or your retirement plan over 10 years. It's just way too long. And I couldn't imagine setting a budget on numbers that were 9 years old, for example, as far as that. So
we're rescheduled to do one right now.
it should be done fairly frequently with small adjustments for inflation in between. And then yes, if you replace something either through insurance proceeds or through reserves, then it resets the life and recalculates out. As for the question about the inspection that occurred prior to, and I'm assuming you're talking about the or the turnover inspection?
No, our building did a integrity inspection prior to the requirement.
I think you've got to have that updated. I mean, a lot of the footwork has been done, so the hard work, the heavy lifting's been done. You can use the whoever you retain to update that to comply with the milestone inspection.
Yeah.
Can use that data,
Yep.
so that's fine.
Yeah,
I don't think it substitutes
No,
for
but it
this.
can be updated, right?
It can be updated, that's fine.
Redoing the whole thing.
Yeah. One other point I want to make on that, something you said brought something to my brain, and that is, this is not just about regulatory compliance in terms of making the legislature and the division in Tallahassee happy. This also has an enormous impact on the insurance industry because they're going to want to see that you've done recent inspection reports. They want to know what the condition of the building is, I believe, Joe. And also, if you're going to borrow money, I had a client in yesterday that they're going to spend almost $10 million on renovations. Sort of like the Surfside piece to make it look pretty, okay? And that's fine, they can afford to do that. But they need, the bank in that case is going to lend them some money, and the bank's going to be looking for updated inspection reports. They're going to be looking for good insurance coverage and so on and so forth, risk management stuff. So it's not just to sort of dot the I's and cross the T's to be in regulatory compliance. There are also some very big drivers to make sure that you have a well-maintained building, and insurance is one of them.
Good segue, Chris. Thank you. Yeah.
Lots of questions going on. Over here,
Okay, this question is Matt, and I also have one for you, Chris. But Matt, in the building where I'm located, new roofs, new windows, new entry doors, new updated elevators, alarm system, everything. Now,
the roofer's saying our roof can last 25 years with proper maintenance, maybe 30. So could we put that on that list that way?
With it, yes, yeah, with the
Okay,
25-year remaining useful life, yes.
All right, so what happens 2 years from now? It's now 28 years. I mean, at what point do you have to now take it off of that list and put it on the restricted reserve?
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood the initial question. No, I thought you meant, should we have it on the restricted item? Yes. So if the remaining, so the statute reads, if the remaining useful life is estimated to be more than 25 years,
Right.
then you would not have to fund for its replacement. But you're right, if you wait 10 years now for your next SERS, and that's now 15 years, you're gonna have a big adjustment. So I think you can get away with it the way the law is written. I think that's a bit of one of the fixes we were trying to get done this year, was to make that a little more frequently, because it's too long to look in between. But essentially, yes, if you have an item that would have a useful life of more than 25 years today, it doesn't go on your SERS until the next time you would update your SERS.
Okay, the other one is electrical systems in our buildings. I mean, if you're, copper wire and such,
Yeah.
there is no real maintenance. How do you even look at that? I mean, if you were going to do a reserve study, what would you say?
Right, so, but in each building's different, so I'm cautious when I say this, but in most cases, yeah, your copper wiring is not going to have something that's going to be, for this area, that's going to need to be completely replaced in the next 25 years. So we would classify it as one of those, we call it long-lived items in our terminology in the reserve study world, long-lived. Sometimes have an indeterminate useful life. You could throw the foundation of the building likely into this category as well. Now, with electrical systems, you might have generator, switchgear, you might have other pieces, bus bars, things like that in the building that might show up in that 25-year window, but like a complete replacement of all electrical systems on a building that's 20 years or less is just not something that I typically would recommend or require for funding. I mean, it has to have something unique with that particular building for us to recommend that.
Chris, my question to you is that, in our particular building, I'm not too concerned about the restricted reserve. But there are buildings throughout this state that did not, protect themselves, didn't put money in the reserves. Now all of a sudden this is going to happen, and owners are not going to have the money to do that. I mean, is the legislature, aware of what's going to happen when 24 comes and passes?
I'm sure they are, but I think you've got to, I'm not a policy maker, but I think that's a policy decision as to whether we end up as a state putting potential lives at stake because it's not funded. I hate to say, if you want to play, if you can't pay, then you can't. If you can't pay, you can't play. But that's the reality of it. And we've heard this argument. I've heard this argument from colleagues on the Florida bar that there's going to be terminations. I'm sure, Matt, you've heard this too. Will, there's going to be terminations all over the place because residents are not going to be able to afford to do this. And when I was a young associate, a long time ago, I remember having my first conversation with an 85-year-old board president talking about why he ought to fund reserves. And his response to me was, Chris, we don't even buy green bananas. And that's a philosophical position that has to shift. And does everyone get the green bananas? Okay, you guys, they seem to get it on this table, so maybe Laura, you can explain it over there. But I think it's just a shift, and there will be some older condominiums, and we've seen this in Naples with some of the older Gulf Shore, the lower side of Gulf Shore, and the co-ops and what have you, that especially if they had severe damage after Hurricane Ian, are in the process or have terminated, or certainly discussed that. Their residents are very, very old, and it's difficult to compete in this real estate environment unless you have a lot of money. And there are developers who will pay you obscene amounts of money to buy your 50-year-old building, right, Will? and knock it down and build whatever zoning will allow them to build. And that's the reality of it. It's harsh, but I think that the Surfside disaster is driving this, because we cannot have that happen again in our lives, if ever. And if some people just cannot afford the freight, then they gotta go. Just sorry, that's the way it is.
We have
Chris,
some
we
questions
went,
out here.
we'll get right to it.
Yeah, we can get to some of the questions here in just for a second.
We went through that process with a building right here in Naples, heavily damaged by Ian. And very tough. You know, it's someone's home. Folks have been there a very long time. They have an emotional attachment to their place. But the community went, they held a vote, and they eventually decided to not terminate. But it was a very real discussion, Chris, to your point,
Yes.
about whether or not we sell out. And to Chris's point, there are developers looking for land in Naples. It's still a very desirable community. And they have an opportunity for those who didn't want to do it. Their position to their neighbors was that, look, if we go through this, we're going to go through years of construction, special assessments, not being able to use our units like we'd like to enjoy them. And now we can walk away with a bit of change in our pocket here, and if that, you know, is better, it's an option. But again, they stuck with it because of the, I think, more of the emotional attachment to the community itself. So, okay, questions?
Yes, we've got.
Hey, Matt, you mentioned that with the budget, there should be a reserve study that goes out with it. Does that have to be the 30-year study, or can we make it simplified to just be a handful of years for the residents to read through?
Yeah, there's actually like 5 required disclosures. I can list them off. The name of each component in your reserve schedule has to be listed. You don't have to include the whole 30-year study.
Okay.
The name of each component, the replacement cost in today's dollars of that component, the useful life, the total useful life of that component, and the remaining useful life of each component has to be listed in each schedule. If it's a pooled reserve, then you list the starting balance and the contribution to the pooled reserve. If it's a component reserve, you do that for each item. So I guess it's 6 items that have to be listed on
That's
for each
okay, but can it only go out a handful of years? Like, what's got to go out there, you know?
You don't have to disclose the 30-year cash flow.
So you can go.
Or the 25-year cash flow is now.
So you can do like a 5-year, this is what we have to do in the next 5 years.
You can. Now, keep in mind, the reserve, every item still has to be listed that has a remaining useful life of 25 years or less.
I see.
So you don't have to show it, but you still have to include it in your funding plan, has to incorporate all of the items that fall within the 25 years. I'm just talking about for the budget disclosure, you don't have to say what the balance is each year for the next 30 years and what the contributions are each year for 30 years. It's just looking for that annual budget. And when you have pooled reserves, it's the annual starting point. So January 1st, 2025 balance, and the January 1st, or the 2025 annual contribution. And then I think now, yeah, the separate contribution for the SERS items and a contribution for the non-SERS items would be my recommendation to put some type of a split in there to delineate, and again, be transparent. And that's I've been at the town halls, to your question, you know, the town halls with the legislators where there was, you know, screaming and crying of people that can't afford the units that they live in, and you know, they stood up in that meeting and said, this is tough love, and this is what we're going to do. I mean, there was a lot of proposals this year to access lines of credit, to allow accessing lines of credit instead of reserving, to perhaps push some of the deadlines down the road, and they put their heels in the ground and did not pass that. So it is a bit of tough love, and I think the important thing to remind people is there is equity in their units, hopefully, at this point. And as board members, we just have to be transparent. We don't want our members in that situation where they have to walk away from the unit or that situation. Like, let them know what's wrong.
Yeah, I want to make sure everyone understands that, you know, it's not within your fiduciary duty to be nice here, okay?
Yeah.
Compassion isn't a defense to getting sued for breach of fiduciary duty. Your job is to act in good faith, as a reasonably prudent person would act, and in a manner which is in the best interest of the association as a whole. And the fact that some people may have to sell, it's unfortunately just too bad. And it's not going to be good in your deposition. You say, well, I was so sorry for Mrs. Smith. You know, she was a widow, she couldn't afford it, therefore we decided we're going to waive the reserves for this 1 more year. We don't want to do that in the building. Something terrible happens. So let's not have that.
Got a couple questions here. Let's take a
A
switch.
couple remedial quick questions, hopefully. A special assessment, you have to have a vote. Do we have to have that for structural? I mean, if the service comes in and says, we need to have this much in?
Yep, it's required.
It-
No
it-
vote. It's required, the board is obligated to.
Okay, so no vote.
No vote
Okay.
membership.
Next question. Just, I'm unclear on the interpretation. Let's say I have a 20-year item, the service is done in 10 years, and I need to fund $1 million, okay? Do I need to have $500,000 now, or I just have $100,000 every year for the next 10 years?
Is the definition of fully funded, and I want to, just because we say a lot, we're going to need fully funded reserves, and the reserves have to be fully funded. There are two definitions of fully funded, and they're not the same thing, and so I'm going to, what you kind of described, I'll use I'll use an example that I'm familiar with, because the math is hard sometimes in groups like this. So $100,000 roof, 10-year life. A fully funded balance means exactly what you said. You've got to have half of that balance. You have to have $50,000 in year 5, $70,000 in year 7. That is not what Florida is asking us to do. They're not asking us to have a fully funded balance. They're asking us to have a fully funded budget, which means, say we're in year 7, but the previous 7 years we've waived the reserves. So now we've got 3 years to get money for this $100,000 roof. The budget has to have $33,332. You don't have to make up for the prior 7 years, except for you have the time left on the component life to get there.
Okay, that was
So
the
you get the money
clarification.
when you get there, not going back, and that's. So if you're saying fully funded, clarify, a fully funded balance would mean, yeah, we've got everything and it's all lined up, and really that definition is for like every item in the schedule has all the money set aside. That's usually overkill, honestly, and so we look at more. That's why a lot of associations are looking at that pooled reserve to just say, we just need the money when it's needed. We have to have stable funding between now and then. We can't put $10,000 for the first 2 years and then $80,000 in year 3. It has to be stable funding. But we do have time in most cases until the major components are needed. Now, if everything's needed in year 1, then you've got to come up with the whole $100,000 in year 1.
And going back to that question on the vote, the non-structural pieces, do those still, reserve items, do those still need a vote? Or is it all just kind of lumped under it now where it's a reset?
Yeah, so, Chris, stop me if I'm wrong, I don't want to practice law here, but the vote is, the vote is required for any waiver or partial funding of reserves. You cannot vote to waive structural integrity reserves on any budget adopted after December 31st of this year. So some of you are saying, well, I adopt my budget in December 1st for the following year. In that case, I think you can still vote, and the vote is needed by the membership, majority of the voting interests.
And note that there was a recent change in the statute, I think it was last year.
Yeah.
And that it's when you do the waiver for the non-CERS items, it's a majority of the total voting interests, not just a majority of those people at a meeting at which there is a quorum. So if your quorum requirement is a third, it's no longer a majority just of the third.
Right. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, then going back to the pooled item real quickly. You said that we need 2 separate sets of books for the CERS and non-CERS, but we can have one reserve account.
So the statute, Maintenance Administrative Code has something in it that says funds can be commingled for investment purposes only. So you could actually commingle, I think, operating and reserve funds. I don't think most people do that, but they can be commingled for investment purposes only. So you could have one investment account that has those funds, but you do have to have a liability line for each one on the other side of the balance sheet.
Okay, thank you, appreciate it.
I thought that the present legislation says that we could not commingle operating and reserve. You're saying that's changed?
You cannot commingle operating reserves except for investment purposes, I believe is the language. Chris, you got the whole book there. You
I
want
do. We have a question here.
Yes. I'm hearing for budgets adopted after December 31st. So we're required, based on budgets, to provide for statutory reserve. So if we do the budget for next year, we fully reserve and charge during year. We don't have to have all those funds as of January 1 of that year, but they have to be in the budget for the full year. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct.
Okay. So I have a question about reserves again. So if and some items are, we've already got funding to replace those, and the membership has voted on that, but they won't be replaced by next January. How do we account for those in the reserves? The money's obviously been taken, and it just, the improvements haven't taken place yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. So and it's a little technical on the answer. You can't have a 0 remaining useful life in your schedule. So, because you can't divide by 0. So you would have to, what I would say in that case is you would stop funding for the current replacement. And I would take, say you've got $100,000 and the project's $100,000. And it's a 10-year project, I would put 0 as your starting balance, 10 years as the remaining useful life, and another $100,000. So you're essentially funding next year, you're funding the next replacement. So you're kind of funding a stable amount each year. Now, if you've got $120,000 in the bank, the project's only going to be $100,000. You've already got $20,000 in there, then it's going to be a smaller amount that you would start funding. So the math, we'd have to probably sit down and run the math on that, but no, you don't have to continue. And if you have an item, let's say it still has a year of life left on it, and you've already got all the funds available, you don't have to continue to put money into that category. If you've got the bucket full of everything that you're going to need for that item, that particular category.
But if I've done an assessment, I already got the money for the replacement, and I'm going to spend it in 2025, how do I just then put a little bit in, or?
Yeah, you're right. Your 2025 budget would show the replacement cost, and the remaining useful life would be the full life of the new item. So you're starting to fund the next year. Essentially, you funded everything up to this point. Now you're going to fund the next time around. And if it's a 30-year item, you don't worry about it. If it's 25 or less, you put it in.
And where do you put these funds? In one bank account, in one bank?
We're trying to find out.
Yeah.
In multiple bank accounts, in multiple banks, FDIC, et cetera? Do you call it reserve?
I'm not an investment.
Yeah, we would have separate accounts, can be in the same bank, but separate accounts. And in fact, your reserve account, if you're doing well and you have a large sum of money there, we're going to further protect it by putting it into a sweep account. Which
I know
is,
what that is.
sure. So FDIC insurance, folks, $250,000 limit. So if you have, let's say, $600,000, you're going to see multiple accounts. And a sweep account, what it does is you have one account where the money goes in as we make transfers once you collect your maintenance payments. When you hit that 250 threshold, it sweeps it into another account so that the next account, which is the next 250, and then another one for 100,000, you constantly have FDIC coverage.
I thought and I may be wrong on this, I thought the FDIC rule was that you can have multiple accounts, but if they're all the same thing, then it counts as one account.
I think she means if they're all the same bank.
Yeah, I'm experiencing that personally.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm raising it.
So the sweep account takes it to other banks, not other.
Oh, it goes to other banks.
It would have to be
Other banks, other accounts, and...
Okay, not all in the same bank.
Right. If you were to look at one of our financial statements, you look at your bank statement, you're going to see it separated out. Classified under reserves, but separated out in those accounts. And again, we moved that to that as a matter of practice, folks, years ago when there were a couple of bank failures. And wanted to make sure, we didn't experience any, thank goodness. But we wanted to make sure that our clients were covered in that regard. So if you don't have that, talk to whoever is covering your banking and make sure you move to that kind of program. Yes, sir.
In the unlikely event that a structural item reserve amount turns out to be more than it costs to replace it, can the surplus be moved to operations, or does that excess amount have to stay in a reserve?
Yeah, no, that has to stay in reserves. But the good news is you have a surplus, you can allocate it towards what other items you have to fund.
Just to clarify on the commingling, I found the statute here, I'm glad I brought it, threw it in my briefcase. 17-111-14, commingling, all funds collected by an association shall be maintained separately in the association's name. For investment purposes, which is what Matt was saying, for investment purposes only, reserve funds may be commingled with operating funds of the association. Okay? I think we got to move on from this because poor old Joe on my left here has been sitting here, you know.
This is the most quiet I've ever been, other than when I sleep at night. This is pretty much the longest stint I've gone without talking.
Well, I just want to introduce Joe by saying that, usually it's the lawyer that everybody hates in these meetings. We're responsible for everything. You can either blame my friend on the right, who's engineer and reserve advisors, who's costing all this extra money for you guys, or worse, you can blame Joe. So I feel pretty good today. I'm a good guy. So here's insurance, and Joe will tell us what's going on in the world of insurance.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. So obviously, looking at this first through the lens of the CSRS and the milestone, we all know, Chris's introduction was spot on. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And it's really put towers and multi-story buildings, especially older ones, under the underwriting microscope, right? So now we have these underwriters that are just laser focused on these issues. And we would never have imagined the lines of coverage that were impacted from this tragedy, right? So we never thought when this happened, obviously we were just thinking about how terrible it was, but nobody realized what the reverberations were going to be for the insurance industry, but now we do. We're painfully aware of that. So one of the biggest things, when you think about the collapse that people don't realize, is that typically with any property insurance carrier from an ex-wind standpoint, collapse is covered under the standard ISO language. However, collapse is not covered when there's visible damage associated with the structure. So technically, you have a situation where the carrier that was involved with Champlain Tower South could have very well declined that and not paid the policy limit as they did. Now, the reason for them not doing that is because I don't think anybody from a publicity standpoint wants to be the carrier that denied a claim when you have almost 100 people that lost their lives. So you have to really be laser focused on the fact that insurance is the most important thing you're ever going to purchase, ever, while you're on the board. There's no question about it. And more importantly, you want to make sure that you're adequately covered for whatever you're purchasing with respect to your insurance. So that's the biggest issue we're dealing with right now. So when you look at Champlain Tower South, you look at CSRS Milestone, something that we didn't anticipate that would be impacted was the rate associated with the ex-wind perils of your property policy. So in some cases, like with Champlain Tower South, they had a wind policy only, and they had a separate policy for all other property perils with a company called Great American. Great American was the preeminent, premier, most competitive ex-wind carrier that we had ever had in the Florida market for condominium associations. Literally the day after the collapse, they pulled out of the state, and they're no longer writing towers for that risk. So as a result, overnight, the rate for ex-wind basically doubled in the state of Florida for condominium associations. Before, it was about a 15-cent rate, some 12 to 15-cent rate per every $100 of insurable value, went to approximately 30 cents, 35 cents because of that tragedy and the fact that the other carriers that do that type of risk are not companies that are admitted companies. They're excess and surplus lines companies. So it became more difficult from that standpoint. We started to see unique exclusions be carved into these policies as well relative to bodily injury related to structural issues. So you have to be on the lookout for that now. Another line of coverage that was adversely impacted was casualty, right? So your general liability, huge impact. Now, carriers always ask, they want some type of an engineering report. And this was pre-milestone legislation. They said, we want an engineering report now. We want some type of a cursory review signed by an engineer that states this building is safe and there are no issues that need to be remediated, repaired, et cetera, et cetera. In the absence of providing that, you are now available for coverage. However, the coverage that you're available to achieve is going to be coverage that is with excess and surplus lines carriers, that is just fraught with exclusions that don't cover anything. One of the most common ones we see now is a collapse exclusion, a complete collapse exclusion, meaning if there's some type of a collapse and there's a lawsuit that's tendered over to the association related to bodily injury, there is no coverage for defense or indemnity with respect to that type of a claim. Same can be said for balcony injury exclusions. We've seen those as well. And generally just any type of an exclusion related to property damage or bodily injury that is collapse related or structural integrity related. So it's really important. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. And with the law specifically states now that if you don't do this, you're breaching your fiduciary responsibility, right, as a board member. If you knowingly breach your fiduciary responsibility, guess what doesn't cover you? Your directors and your officers coverage, right? So then where does that leave you from the standpoint of lawsuits that come in? Well, it leaves you with basically nothing. You're bare. So back to Chris's briefcase and the resignation letters he had, you're welcome to sign those today. But in all seriousness, I know most everyone in this room, if not every board, you're on top of it. But there's a lot of boards that are not on top of it, unfortunately. So these things are Very important, and it had a huge impact in the industry for us. Another line of coverage that was adversely impacted was the umbrella market. So traditionally, we have risk purchasing group programs that specialize in condominium association risk. And these risk purchasing group programs are very robust in the coverage that they provide. They give you at least $25, $50, $75, $100 million umbrella limits that sit in excess to your $1 million limit of directors and officers. They sit in excess to your general liability, your hired and non-owned auto liability, potentially employee benefit liability if you have employees. They sit over your workers' comp and a number of other exposures. So because of Champlain Tower South, the RPG that was on that particular exposure pulled out of the state literally after that happened because they paid the policy limits, which again, they didn't have to, but they chose to do that because they're not going to be involved in a situation where they're viewed as not cooperating in that type of a severe claim that's a tragedy. When that happened, what do you think the other RPG programs did? They all started to change their underwriting guidelines. Many of them also retracted from the state and no longer write. So in the absence of getting into one of these risk purchasing group umbrella programs, you're now only eligible for excess liability only at a significantly less limit, maybe $5, $10 million max, and it will only sit over your general liability policy. It won't sit over any of those other policies that you have. So again, it puts you into a precarious position from a coverage standpoint because now you're with an excess and surplus lines company where, frankly, not only from a coverage standpoint, economically, you're paying probably 8 times more what you paid in RPG. So you might have a situation where you were paying $6,000, $8,000 for a $25 million, $50 million umbrella to where now you're paying $25,000, $35,000 for $5 million that just sits over your general liability if you're lucky. So that's happening with a lot of older towers right now, unfortunately. So it's something that we've been grappling with. And a lot of these programs are just not writing anymore because of that risk and that exposure. D&O is another one that we're seeing where the D&O carriers are not liking the high rises anymore. They're just not interested in providing an option. So in the absence of finding one of these admitted, very preferential D&O programs, you're going to end up in a program that is, again, excess and surplus lines that has high retentions, not your typical $2,500 retention. You're looking at like $25,000, $50,000 retention for a D&O claim, also fraught with tons of exclusions as well. And one big thing to note about D&O that I think is a misconception is that D&O does not cover anything related to bodily injury, period, and does not cover anything related to property damage, period. So if you have a claim that the originating event, the cause of the origin of the loss is one of those two items, your D&O is not going to respond. So don't think that because of Champlain Tower South, all these carriers that paid out their limits, they only did that because it's a tragedy, and hopefully it's a one-off thing that never happens again. But realistically, if you're in that situation, they're not going to pay. They're going to pay for traditionally things like breach of fiduciary responsibility, breach of contract, employment practices related issues, discrimination, etc. That's what your D&O is for. So it's really important to know what is in your policies, especially now in this environment where things are just under the microscope from an underwriting standpoint. When you look at all these other lines of coverage that for years and years and years were very stable. And frankly, were just sort of an afterthought comparatively to the property premium and the property exposure and the flood when applicable as well. So it's really been eye-opening from that standpoint. We're seeing a little bit of a softening, obviously, in the market on the property side. There's been a lot of changes, and things are getting better. That's kind of a separate conversation that gets back to one of the special sessions that happened back in December of 22. A lot of the legislative reforms for insurance were enacted at the beginning of last year, and we're now just starting to see that kind of trickle up and reach fruition with respect to a lot of the tort reform, which is going to be hugely impactful. A lot of the carriers that are now coming into the state, they have capacity. They're new sort of startup companies that are willing to try to survive in Florida. And the good news is now that they've started effective beginning of last year, they don't have any of that downstream litigation exposure that all of the companies had for many years that were doing business here. So that's kind of gone to the wayside. So luckily, that's going to be the new normal in Florida. The foundation has kind of been built where these companies aren't going to be litigated to death and they're going to actually survive, hopefully. The only thing that we really can't account for is what's going to happen in the storm season. We just don't know. That's always the temporary variable that could sort of derail the progress that we have. So I think that's an important reform. In addition, assignment of benefits has been sort of eliminated for property insurance. And the fact that now you have to file a claim within 1 year of a named storm is hugely important. Before, it was 2 years. Prior to that, it was 3 years after Irma, which is just complete nonsense because that creates an environment of fraud. You get unscrupulous actors that really just built the system, unfortunately, with regard to protracted claims, litigation going on where you have these bad actors of roofing companies and public adjusters, bad actor ones, that were getting involved only because they could inflate the claim and ultimately they'd get paid out their fees at an excess level that's not normal compensation. It would be at a fee multiplier level. So all to the wayside, all very beneficial things going on from a property insurance standpoint. But the Champlain Tower South shockwave is not going away anytime soon. And it is immensely important to focus on the health and the safety of your building, but also from a building envelope integrity standpoint, right? I mean, while the reserve study will, reserves focuses on, common openings, it's also important to think about all of the exterior openings. And we know that's a big nut to replace if you're a building that doesn't already have impact glass or impact rated materials. It's a material item with regard to how you're going to be modeled and what the rate will ultimately be for your building. So if you're not focused on that, and you're expecting magic to happen on your insurance rate, it's not going to, because a lot of the other variables that are associated with the modeling, they're fixed variables. For example, your geographic location. That's not going to change that you're on the water. And why would you want it to change? It's a beautiful location, but not the best location for reinsurers and for insurance companies to look at. They look at the age of the construction, which again, is a constant. We can't change that. Yes, sir.
So being an impact window and door contractor myself, I get asked the question all the time, which is, hey, if we fully replace all of our openings at our building, what kind of insurance savings will we get? So I am posing the question to you for these folks.
If you sign up today,
yes.
No, I'm just joking. So my answer to that is always that the market is, it's organic, it's a live market, it's changing, it's cyclical, just like any market, real estate market, stock market. The underwriting guidelines change from honestly day to day. The underwriting discipline restricts, contracts, loosens, et cetera, liberalizes. So because of that, I could probably answer the question as of right now. Again, I can't do the modeling of the particular building, but all those variables I mentioned play into that. So what we've seen in some of the hypothetical models that we've run with insureds that are asking that exact same question could be anywhere from 25% to 40% reduction.
And that's actually what I do tell people to kind of, but
yeah.
Again, it's based on.
It's based on a lot of factors, so it's hard to just take that and cement that as your property, but also keep in mind that it brings in other companies and different capacity that wouldn't be a player for a building that's not fully mitigated.
Thank you.
So that just opens up more economics, because that's what our job is ultimately, is to get that economic advantage where you have multiple players involved, and then that way we can leverage those players against one another to create the most favorable rates, best terms, conditions, et cetera, for you with respect to the coverage. So yeah, that's the position we want to be in.
What's the life of the windows?
The light?
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you that there are different warranties from different manufacturers.
Not the warranty, just the actual life that the engineer would say these windows can last how many years?
20 years.
Okay.
Bill, if I can make a comment on that. Joe had made a comment about building envelope. And a lot of our discussion this afternoon has been about reserves, which are future-based. But I would tell you to watch your budget in the here and now when you're passing your budget, looking at the R&M, repairs and maintenance. It's one of the areas where quite often the board looks like I can get some savings there. So leave it this way. Those exterior doors, most of them are metal. And when you head back to your buildings today, take a look at them. They may be a couple years old. And if you start to see that little bit of pitting from rust, et cetera, you're at the point right now where you can salvage that door. It's a pretty easy repair. And make sure you get that full lifespan on it, right? Sand it down, a little rust inhibiting primer, and a new coat of a good exterior paint. Will keep that door around, versus if you let it go, that rust will just continue to spread before you know it, it's gone. And now you're doing that replacement well in advance of what you had originally intended to do. So there's a lot to be said about what you're doing in the here and now that will make a very big difference on your long-term cost.
Any other insurance questions?
Maybe it's not the forum for this question, but what are you seeing as far as the adjustment of claims, primarily for flood, for FEMA? Are you seeing a lot of pushback, a lot of delay, a lot of pushback on
Depends
claims.
on your adjuster in a lot of cases. So unfortunately, with flood, with condominium associations, we're all at the will of the National Flood Insurance Program, overwhelmingly. Very few condos have a private flood option. So you have a number of intermediaries involved in the process. You've got the field adjuster that comes out. You've got the servicing carrier's desk adjuster. You have the agent involved. You have the FEMA adjuster. So just by sheer will of the number of intermediaries involved, it's going to take a lot of time. But I've seen claims move a lot faster when you have adjusters that are actually responsive, that are kind of on top of it. That's been one thing that we've seen. But when we're dealing with a lot of these catastrophic claims, some of which that we're still dealing with a lot of buildings that are going through renovations and reconstruction, claims are still ongoing. So it really just depends on the severity of your loss, depending on the age of your building. Are you pre-firm, are you post-firm? You know, what are you looking to get? Is it more of a cleanup and muck out argument, or is it really the first level of your building was completely destroyed and you're still rebuilding it? So there's a lot to unpack with regard to the specificity of the claim issue. But to answer your question, there are quite a few folks that still have an open FEMA claim going on from Ian, and it's not unusual.
Yeah, when your adjuster lives 6 states away and lives in a mobile home and chases storms, we found it's becoming increasingly more difficult to get any attention.
Colonial Claims by chance?
Yes.
Yeah, so they're based in Kentucky. Not to say Kentucky has a lot of mobile homes, but
Right.
it might. So yeah, it depends.
It's amazing, you knew the firm immediately.
Yeah, long story. Yeah, unfortunately, there's been some negative experiences with field adjusters and adjusters moving around, adjusters not being responsive, then they transfer it. So then it's like that new adjuster has to come in and sort of reorient to everything going on. And if it's pretty far through the process, it's going to take them some time to really get up to speed on it. So it really is one of those questions where it depends. You know, some folks got their money quickly, but again, those were less impacted risks than some of the pre-firm buildings and buildings that had severe damage.
Hey, Joe, got a question over here.
Sure.
So recently in our building, several people got letters saying that the flood plain level had been adjusted and changed.
Right.
And suddenly we were in the floodplain, we're now out of the floodplain. What impact does that have as far as the FEMA guidelines?
Yeah. So if you've been taken out from a floodplain management standpoint and there's no lending requirement for your building to have or your buildings to have flood insurance, then you do not have to purchase that. So from a bank standpoint, so that's something that you definitely want to confirm and double check. So if you truly have been taken out, you're in an X zone now, you're not in an AE, then that's a huge deal from that standpoint. However, I would say, because of Ian, if you were in an AE and they've just happened to shift you into an X, still might behoove you to consider continuing to purchase flood insurance because of where everybody is and what we saw, what we experienced. Because at the end of the day, you know, no matter where you are really in Florida, we're all sort of in a flood zone to some extent, even if you're a few miles, you know, inland from the coast. But it's something that I did see, and we've had a couple of clients that have had come out as well, and they're exploring and discussing whether or not they're going to continue to purchase flood insurance.
And make sure you check your declaration of condominium, because it might make it mandatory. Most declarations have 2 categories, mandatory insurance and optional. Flood is often in the optional category, but it may or may not be in your case if historically it's already been in the flood zone. So if you don't want to violate the declaration, you may need to do an amendment to that. But there's a further discussion I think you need to have before you make a decision.
Good question.
What about EVs parked inside the building and go from the garages?
Yeah, that's
and bicycles.
It's a huge issue. Yeah, so we recently did a panel discussion on that with a company that does EV charging station installation. We had a number of folks that were part of that. So interestingly, we had not traditionally seen any sort of exclusionary language with regard to EV charging stations or EVs. However, we had a situation recently where on the casualty program or general liability, there was a complete blanket, what they call an absolute exclusion for EVs, period. Any electric vehicle, they went through scooters, e-bikes, cars, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem for this particular association was that, you know, number one, they didn't have a lot of EVs, people driving, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but they had a few residents that used sort of an EV scooter for mobility issues, and they had to bring it into the building. So the issue becomes, well, if that EV scooter catches on fire, they overcharge it, whatever causes bodily injury or property damage, there's no coverage for that association at all. So I think carriers are more keen on it now, knowing what happens with lithium-ion batteries and knowing what could occur after a claimed event like storm surge. We had one on Marco Island where it was a Tesla. It burned really hot underneath the building envelope, and it contaminated the concrete in the parking garage. So it was a significant loss for them to repair, $100,000+ worth of damage. So these things are a really big deal. And if you have an owner that's installing their own EV charging station, which they can by law in their own limited common element parking spot or their garage, they have to have insurance. They have to provide you with a copy of property insurance and casualty insurance showing that they're covering EV charging stations, and you have the option to be named as an additional insured to make sure that you're protected, right? Now, some issues with that, a lot of the HO6 carriers won't cover that. They won't cover anything outside the confines of the unit. So when the legislature put that together a few years ago, really didn't think that through. They should have consulted with some insurance people, because I don't know many personalized carriers that can extend coverage to that sort of an item. So I don't know how people have been able to get coverage for those, and that's a big deal. So typically with EVs, we recommend outside the building envelope, if you can, for charging purposes. Obviously, you can't stop people from parking their electric vehicle in the garage if they're going to. I guess you could try. Another thing you might want to consider is verifying that people have the requisite limits of auto insurance for bodily injury and for property damage if they have any on site. So that could certainly be the source of a claim. And if it's somebody else's vehicle because of some sort of faulty defect or overcharging, verify that they have, those limits in place. Verify that they have a personal umbrella that sits over and beyond what that minimal limit could be for the EV. So there's a lot of EV stuff going on. It's sort of proliferating. I think the last statistic was that there's about 60,000 EVs registered in the state of Florida. By 2030, they're saying almost 600,000. So it's just going to continue to, I know it's a possibility it won't happen. I think there's some economics behind it for why it might not occur, but I know with General Motors, they've invested $38 billion in EVs, or they're going to through 2030. So there's a lot of traction there and a lot of issues to think about.
I've been asked, and I was actually working on it before I came over here this morning, by a couple of condominium association clients to draft a hold harness and indemnification program, or agreement rather, if you want to put your EV at the condo.
Makes sense. It's good practice.
Just if you want to park it, not charge it, just park it.
All right, are you ready to go to the Corporate Transparency Act, which is all going to be
Oh my gosh.
quick of a topic as of this week?
Joe, I wanted to ask you something that might be helpful to the ladies and gentlemen here today. I review a lot of contracts and reviewed a lot after Hurricane Ian for demolition, for reconstruction and repair, everything, okay? And usually for a lot of money, 7 figures and up, okay? Handsome 7 figures. First of all, if you have those types of contracts, you should be having your legal counsel review them, because some of the contracts that come out, especially in the wake of a tragedy, are not much. I'm looking for a cocktail napkin. I don't see one, but they're really like a cocktail napkin type agreement, okay? They're just horrible. And I've got one right now where a very sophisticated client, for some reason or other, I think because they were desperate after Hurricane Ian hit, signed up with an unlicensed demolition company. They're licensed out of state, but they weren't licensed in Florida. And we're having some difficulty with that and getting all the insurance money they should be entitled to because of that. We're going to get around it in other ways, but it was so unnecessary. We didn't need to do that. But if you were here when Ian hit, if you've been through a tragedy, people go a little crazy, and it's a rush to sign up contractor A or contractor X. First one that gets there, they're going to focus on your project, and if you don't get there, you're going to have all the owners, coming down from up north with their pitchforks and torches at the condo gate, and they're going to be ready for you. So, but don't, we need to have cooler heads prevail, but I'm beginning to see more contracts with fairly low limits from contractors. And I had looked at an elevator one for a named elevator company the other day. Their first draft was $1 million for liability. They've got 8 elevators in the building. And I was like, no way, are you kidding me? Well, we went back and we asked what the client asked. I told the client about it. They got 10 million just like that. But if you don't get it to me, or you don't get it to your insurance agent, or you don't get it to Castle Group and tell them about it, and you just sign it, which is what happens, we're done. We can't do anything about it. So it's an easy fix. So Joe, do you want to comment about, like what I like to do is, I don't want to comment on what the appropriate limits are, but what I tell my client is, you need to talk to your insurance broker, because I don't know what coverages you have when you have these significant reconstruction contracts, whether they're for painting or whatever they're for. You want to comment on
Yeah,
that?
absolutely, yes. So I mean, I think there's a lot to be said with contractual liability and the issues and the exposures that come with that, because we all think traditionally with insurance, oh, perils, named storms, fire, et cetera, that's where the big issues, the big claims are going to come from. Well, no, not necessarily. To Chris's point, you're going to be partnering with these third-party vendors that are coming on site. They're bringing a tremendous amount of liability with them, whether they're doing things in the common areas, whether they're going into an individual unit owner's unit to reconstruct or renovate the unit, say it's a major unit renovation. You definitely do want to have the insurance agent review the contract and your attorney. The insurance side will focus on the insurance section. The elevator companies are the worst for that. They try to deflect as much liability as possible, and they hope you sign it in that way that they're completely off the hook for anything related to not only products and completed operations, but also bodily injury claims, or property damage. So it's very important that these sections, the indemnification section, is looked at and reviewed. But more importantly, we happen to use an independent contractor agreement, a boilerplate one, to provide with some limits that we would recommend relative to bodily injury, relative to umbrella, also specialized coverages. For example, if you have a large landscaping contract with a landscaper and they're spraying pesticides and herbicides, and you don't have pollution or bacteria coverage as an association, and somebody gets sick from the pesticides or herbicides that were used, are you going to be able to have coverage when they tender a lawsuit over and they name you as one of the parties in the suit? The answer is no. So ensuring that some of these specialized contractors have those special types of insurance that are needed. Pool contractor, there's specific pool insurance, limited pollution liability, they're using pool chemicals. Some of the pool, when the pools are constructed or redone, there's a casualty loss called a pool pop, where the shell actually pops out of the ground from pressure changes when they're doing the water. There's a special coverage for that they have to have. They have to be in a special pool program for contractors. So depending on the severity of the work and what the contractor is doing, these things could happen. More importantly, we really would recommend that you are named as an additional insured. And the kind of secret with that is that just because they give you a certificate of insurance that says, hey, we're naming ABC Condominium Association Inc. as an additional insured, it doesn't mean anything. It's not even worth the paper it's printed on until it's required by contract and they sign it. Because that's what it says in the insurance policy, additional insured when required by contract. So it's not actually activated until you have a contract getting you additional insurance status and getting you primary and non-contributory status. So if you get that lawsuit tendered to you, you just give that right over to the contractor and say, here you go, you're the one who caused this, we're additional insured, we want to use all your limits first, then we'll be second party to it if in fact we have to be, but we want you to be primary. And you can't just get that through a certificate of insurance, because frankly, a certificate of insurance is nothing more than an insurance agent giving their client a piece of paper that's just reflective of the limits that they have. And they'll type anything in there, these administrative people that do that, but it doesn't give you anything other than just verifying that they have insurance, they have limits, etc. But a lot of times it's just packed away, and it's assumed, yeah, we've got their certificate of insurance, but well, to Chris's point, he's looking at the contract, $1 million of liability, no umbrella, they're doing an elevator, what about the products and completed operations exposure, what about property damage? So there's a lot of questions to ask, and again, it's really worth its weight in gold to have attorney review it and your insurance agent so we can focus in on the indemnification and get you that proper guidance on the limits of insurance that you'll need and what types of special insurance would apply.
And watch for the fine print that says the contract's governed by the laws of the state of Nevada. I'd like to go to Vegas, but not for that. All right, we're going to just move the agenda around just a little bit. We're going to switch corporate transparency. It's such a thrilling subject. We're going to save that towards the end of the program. A little bit because it dovetails with what Joe was talking about. Joe had mentioned that in early 2023, there was some effort to engage in some tort reform that the Governor DeSantis and Paul Renner, who is the House Speaker, clearly, and I've got a quote here from Renner that says, these reforms make our economy more competitive and Florida more affordable for our citizens and business. So this was all part of tort reform. And surprisingly, I haven't seen a lot of lawyers that do what I do really talk about this. But one of the two big changes here. One is the time period within which you can sue, the statute of limitations, changed for general negligence from 4 years to 2 years. That makes a huge difference. So if you've looked at this item in the past and you thought it was 4 years, it's no longer 4, it's now 2. Now that doesn't apply to defects regarding design and construction of a building. That's still at 4 years. But the 2-year for general negligence could catch you out. And you certainly don't want to, what is and what is not general negligence can be argued by lawyers for a long time for a lot of money. But you don't want to be waiting longer than it is necessary and miss the ability to have your claim heard by the court when the other side comes along and files statute of limitations expired as an affirmative defense. So that would be very awkward for you as a board member to report back to the members. So that's just really a heads up. I don't need to get into any more detail on that. If you have that situation, obviously you should be talking to competent counsel. The other thing that changed is what's called the statute of repose. It's a fancy word, it's slightly different than the statute of limitations. Statute of repose is a time period which is really longer than the statute of limitations, but it is an absolute outer limit. You cannot go beyond the statute of repose. Let's say you have a latent defect in a building and you didn't know about it, and upon a diligent search, you didn't find out about it. You hire Matt, and Matt's there doing his inspection. He finds a latent defect, and it's like, oh, okay, maybe we go back to the developer on this and see, or the contractor, or whoever may be around. But the time period for that used to be 10 years. It's now 7. So the statute of repose moved to 7. It also triggered a change in the countdown clock on the statute, changed from the later of certain triggering events to the earlier of certain triggering events, to the earliest of a temporary certificate of occupancy, a full-blown certificate of occupancy or certificate of completion, or the date of abandonment of construction if not completed. A little bit getting too deep in the weeds really for this group today, but once again, if you have construction-related problems, need to be careful of that and seek appropriate legal advice. All right, that's that. Okay, I know that Laura's been burning for me to get this Florida Corporate Transparency Act. Has anyone not heard of the CRA, the Corporate Transparency Act? Anybody not heard of it? Everyone's heard about that? It was a big deal at the beginning of the year. Went into effect January 1st of 2024, and it was part of a anti-money laundering tax evasion. There's something called the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, and the Corporate Transparency Act, the CTA, is part of that. And it's a statute that basically attempts to find out who is really behind the ownership of a business entity. Pretty common in a lot of industries, very common in Europe. Those of you who may have done business in Europe would have been used to this. It's now in Canada where they've introduced it. And it's simply designed to combat money laundering and other illicit activity. For some reason or other, Congress thinks there's all sorts of bad things happening in your community association where you might be also engaged in bad behavior. So while there are 23 exceptions to this statute, you're not one of them. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because I don't think that there's a lot of bad behavior of this type going on in associations. So it'd be nice if they would add a 24th exemption, but they haven't. And the reality of this is that before January the 1st of 2025, and I would interpret that as December 31st, 2024, because that seems to be D-Day for pretty much everything that we've talked about today. You're required to fill out a form if you're on the board. This would apply to all the officers and directors, of your full legal name, your date of birth, your current address, and also provide a copy of your driver's license or a current passport, and that's really all you have to do. Now, some of you may feel uncomfortable about that. I can't do anything about it. I guess if you're uncomfortable about disclosing that information, then I think you just have to resign from the board, because you've got to do this. So we prepared, I was going to hand it out when I first was asked about this. Council Group kindly invited me to be on this panel. A 13-page document, because Denton's does a huge amount of business law for clients all across the country. And we worked on a pretty detailed memo as to what all this means to the more typical business that would need to report on this. And then things started to change. So on Saturday, this past Saturday, I get an email from someone in my office that says, "Oh, the U.S. District Court in the Northern District of Alabama has just ruled that the Federal Corporate Transparency Act is unconstitutional." And I won't go into the reasons of why it's unconstitutional. This is the memorandum. It's 53 pages long. If you really want to read it, you can read it. It's actually pretty interesting reading, but on constitutional law. But they said that was an overreach. Can't do it. So we were like, well, that's great news. So this came out Saturday, and I think I spoke to you, and you were like, oh, because I think I sent you a note saying we're talking about this, but by the way, my comments are going to be shorter than they were going to be because it doesn't exist anymore, so you can do it. As I read an article this morning about this, and it says, well, it's dead on arrival, so you don't need to do anything by December 31st. So while Laura was relieved over the weekend, I hate to tell her, but things changed Monday. So on Monday, let me get this here. FinCEN, which is the the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, abbreviated as FinCEN, F-I-N-C-E-N, all uppercase letters for C-E-N, came out with the following comment. I'm just going to read it verbatim. On March the 1st, 2024, in the case of National Small Business United versus Yellen, a federal district court in the Northern District of Alabama entered a final declaratory judgment concluding that the Corporate Transparency Act exceeds the Constitution's limits on Congress's power and enjoining the Department of the Treasury and FinCEN from enforcing the Corporate Transparency Act against the plaintiffs. FinCEN will comply with the court's order. Well, that's nice of the government to do that, isn't it? For as long as it remains in effect. As a result, the government is not currently enforcing the Corporate Transparency Act against the plaintiffs in that action. Those individuals that were not plaintiffs in the case are required to report regardless of this decision. So FinCEN is taking the position that while the plaintiffs are enjoined, all others must still comply. Now, I talked to one of my partners who's writing all the memorandums for the thousands of lawyers that we have on this, before I came over here, about 10 minutes before I left to come over here, he says there is a case pending in Ohio which might decide this on the same grounds of the Alabama case or on different grounds altogether. So it's going to be a mess. And what will happen is that there will be an appeal by the U.S. Treasury on this decision to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta. And then maybe we'll get the decision out of Ohio, and that'll get appealed, and this ultimately is going to end up where?
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court of the United States. Does that happen overnight? No. So we're in a bit of a bind as to what we do. Frankly, at this point in time, we're going to tell our clients, you got to do it because of this position statement that FinCEN has done. Now, you don't need to do it this week. Laura, where is she? There she is.
Council, our recommendation is fourth quarter. We were going to take a look at everything.
I think that's the fourth quarter. I think you can push it as far as November. You can forget about it over the summer. When you get back here in November and you're beginning to do budgets and financial stuff, that's when I would do it. You could probably push it to around December 1st. But you do have to get all these driver's licenses from everybody, so that can always take a little bit of time. So don't leave it too late, but then you got to wait for updates. So we'll look at it again when we know a little bit more. Yeah, just these memos that I got say, you know, it's going to take some time to get it all sorted out. I do actually have here a copy of the form. The copy of the form that you have to fill out is very simple and straightforward. Nothing particularly significant there, but I understand that there may be some reluctance on the part of someone on the board to do this. People.
Chris, where does this report go?
It goes to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The 501c3 philanthropic, organizational type, charitable contributions, foundations. It doesn't apply to that. And the best way of dealing with this, and I know that Community Associations Institute, CAI, you may be familiar with that. Matt, you mentioned that. You were on a panel with them the other day. I used to be on, a long time ago, I was chair of the National Attorneys Committee. They're trying to lobby Congress to add us to the exemptions. Because I don't see what the abuse here is. We shouldn't really need to do this. But my job is to be the message carrier. So consider the message carrier to you, Laura.
Okay.
You know. The other part you need to do, and this may be a cautionary word to Castle Group, is if there is a change in a director position, someone decides that it's just way too much fun being on the board, therefore I'm going to resign. You appoint somebody else. You got to tell FinCEN about the change. So that's like a fairly significant nightmare. And if you've got Castle Group going to do that for you, you know, that's very kind of them. Because we decided that in our office internally for the time being, it's a legal malpractice trap. So we're not going to do that because you can get in trouble. Now, why is it such a big deal? It's because the penalties are significant. I think the penalties are like $10,000 and or 2 years in jail for willful failure to do this. Now, willful is a big deal, willful. But it's not like you're going to get a letter saying, perhaps you forgot. So it's a little bit more important than that.
There's no friendly warning.
Yeah, so I think we're about out of time. Now, we don't have time today to get through all the changes. I made a list of what I thought were the most significant changes that the Florida legislature is considering. We believe this bill is going to go to the governor's desk and become law, probably effective, what, Matt, July 1, you think? July 1 historically. It could change, but there are some scary things in there. I do want to send a word of caution about official records. Please, if you're managed by Castle Group, I'm sure they do a great job with the records, but I spend so much time messing around with official records, it's not even funny. And it's a very expensive exercise because it's a bully tactic used by owners that are upset with the board. And if you're not represented, if you're not managed by Castle Group, either get with Castle Group or get with your entity that manages you and make sure that they start collecting all the records. There's a provision in here, one of the changes I read about, and Matt, you probably saw this, that if you have records that no longer exist because they were lost or destroyed, and I had that, I had a Fort Myers management company off McGregor Boulevard on the entrance to Sanibel. Their manager's office got completely wiped out, so their documents just were somewhere floating out in the Gulf of Mexico. But we had to send them recorded documents a few days after the storm because they had nothing left. That's not an excuse. You got to go gather them. I'm sure you probably have that exercise where you take over a property and the records are very poor. So don't do that. The other thing, if you're a director, the statute, if it passes, the law if it passes, the bill if it passes, is imposing much more draconian, including criminalization of misdemeanors and felonies if you intentionally mess with someone who's trying to seek access to the records. So there is some gamesmanship that goes on with official records requests, and people get angry about it. If you're a director, don't do that. Let management deal with it because they're professionals. They'll deal with it appropriately. But it's getting to be a subject that is very, very touchy, and really all it requires is that those records be kept digitally, held in the cloud, be put on the website unless they're confidential for one reason or another, and handled appropriately. And I know Castle Group can help you with that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we do that piece. There is a procedure for acquiring your official records if you're going to take on a new community. But we've always been a Florida-based company primarily, and we've always had hurricane procedures. So we were backing up electronically years before it became in vogue, and we have since migrated everything to the cloud. So even if your entire community was destroyed, the moment we get power back, we can have your records back on hand within 24 hours.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I've enjoyed myself. I'm sure Joe and Matt have.
I just got
Will, thank you.
quick thing. So if anybody, quick bill floating out there that is going to likely coalesce with the Senate, I think there's a version. It's 1029. So it's the My Safe Florida Home Grant Program. They're going to be potentially extending that to condominium associations for building hardening purposes. So you potentially could be eligible for to be determined amount of money. There's a cap, I think, in the House version. The Senate version, I think there's no cap for impact glass and roof improvements. So monitor that. I would get in on that as soon as you possibly can, especially if there's some type of a cap to it. I'm sure everybody that is aware of it that's a condo that has a need is going to be applying for that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other closing remarks? Good. Closing.
I think, thank you all for being here. I mean, and dedicating the time to your communities. It's a thankless job. I know that, and I think all these rules and requirements are not for you folks that are here in the room, they're for the people that aren't here. So spread the word, and continue to stay informed, and continue to contact your legislatures on this stuff too. See that bill, has had a call to action. If anybody wants the specific call to action about the CTA Act, I'm happy to share that to them on the board of trustees there as well. So thank you all for being here.
The bill that Joe was referring to, we've had a number of our clients ask us about it. What we don't have anything yet from the legislature is how do you access that money. So as soon as they put it out, if you're a council client, we're going to get word out, minor detail.
Minor detail, yeah.
Minor detail of how to do it, but a number of our clients have said, how do I get my hands on it? Final comment I have is, if you are near executing one of these projects and you're going to have, anywhere between $5 and $15 million being put out there, just remember roles. I had a very heated debate last year with the board president about him wanting to have the property manager be the project manager. And I said, great. The next time you have a toothache, let's call the painter. Because you have to align skill set with the need. Your property manager is there to help you execute your board priorities per 718, 720, whichever one you fall under, to help guide the staff that helps keep your building clean, maintained, etc. But they're not experts in engineering or architectural issues. That's why you have the likes of a Socotech for engineering and so on. Keep that in mind, folks. You have a lot of money at stake. You want these projects to go without a hitch. Politically, you've got to deal with your homeowners who want to know where their money goes. So keep roles in mind. And as Matt said, I thank all of you for your service and thank you for attending today.
Thank you.